Welcome to this lesson on the main medical problems on the Western Front. Use that please as your heading, the title in the green box, and we're going to look at question 1 and question 2. Those are the main focus for this lesson. So we're going to look at what was difficult about moving wounded soldiers and how those problems were solved, and what were the main medical problems and what were the main types of wounds on the Western Front. So there's a lot to do this lesson. Make sure that you have a pen and paper or your history book, or that you have a Word document open to type your notes into. The connect activity is using the pictures from the last lesson, so have a look at each of these below and write down what they represent, what each of these represents, which battle or which period in the war is represented by each of these events. Pause the video while you do that. Okay, so the first thing we're looking at then is problems transporting the wounded, and this painting might help you to start thinking about that. This painting is by an artist called Paul Nash. It was painted in 1918 and it's called the Menin Road. That's up in the north of Belgium. Have a look carefully at this painting. Can you find two figures walking, some corrugated metal, water and shell holes? And this one might be quite difficult. Can you see the road? Writing down then what problems you think there would be transporting somebody who had who was either medically unwell or had a wound. So write down as many problems as you can think of that you can see, thinking about how you might move somebody in this environment. On page 150 in the textbook, remember you can access this online via Active Learn. Have a look at the first two paragraphs, and then for each statement below, copy the black writing and then add an example or a detail to support it. So the first one's been done for you. It says, it was difficult to use vehicles to transport wounded men away from the front line, and then a detail has been added. So roads were destroyed and there were many shell holes like we just saw in the painting. So do the same thing for statement 2, 3 and 4. Pause the video while you do that and look at the textbook. So we're going to evaluate two sources as part of this lesson. The first source is source E, which is on page 150 in the textbook. Read this carefully. I'm going to just let you know a couple of the words. So in the top line it says commenced, which means start. Traverse, it tells you there, it means walk across. And then lower down he says it's less fatiguing, which means less tiring. And you can see there that he's talking about the way that they carry stretchers, and so you can see the old way that he's describing here in the photograph, with two men with straps around their necks and then they're hooked onto the handles of the stretcher, and so that's helping them carry, but that's only two men carrying the wounded man. And he talks in this source here about carrying the stretchers with one at each corner, 4 men carrying a stretcher. So that's what he's describing there. Okay, to help us evaluate this source, we need to think about 3 aspects of it. The first one is the content. So you need to put content or source evaluation as your main heading, content as a subheading, and we're going to use quotes to help us answer these questions 1 to 4. So first question, what problems did the condition of the ground cause the stretcher bearers? So look at the top of the source, and he says here, the country over which we have to carry is most difficult to traverse. So you could put that there as your quote for question 1. Have a go at questions 2, 3 and 4 about the content of the source. We then need to look at the caption. That's the writing at the top before the actual writing by the stretcher bearer. So use this caption, which reads at the top, from Edward Munro's Diaries of a Stretcher Bearer. This entry comes from the 7th of November 1916, when Munro was in the Somme. Very straightforward questions. What job did he do? When was it written? Where? And what type of source is this? It tells you the answers to those in the caption. Pause the video and answer those questions. And we then need to use our contextual knowledge. So this is where we bring in the work that we've already done on understanding the First World War and what medicine was like. So we've looked at these questions already. Answer these questions. This is all helping us work out how useful the source is. So here is an example answer, the beginning of an example answer about how useful this source is. Pause the video and see and read through this example answer. This is not a full answer. In the exam you'll need to write about one side of A4 to answer this, this part of the question. So have a look at how in this example answer they've used the content, the caption and their contextual knowledge to explain why the source is useful. Okay, here is source F. This is on page 151 in the textbook, and this time over to you. You've seen how to do this, so what I want you to do here is think about the content, the caption and the context of the source. Write down 2 points about each of those and then write a paragraph like the one on the previous slide explaining how this source is useful for an inquiry into the problems that were faced by stretcher bearers. Pause the video while you do that. Okay, so clearly it's very difficult to move men. So what did the British Army do? Did they just give up? Well, no. At the start, as well as stretcher bearers, they had horse-drawn ambulances, and they also used trains, just trains with open carriages that would normally have just had sacks of flour or other things in them that people needed to transport. So at the beginning of the war. By October, there had been a newspaper campaign and they had raised money from the public to buy 512 motorised ambulances. And the army used the money to buy these sort of machines and then made them into ambulances. So that really helped because the horse-drawn ambulances, there weren't enough of them and it was really bumpy for the soldiers who were injured to be carried in those. But the motorised ambulances didn't always work brilliantly, particularly in muddy conditions. So they continued to use the horse-drawn ones and stretcher bearers, but these motorised ambulances were much better and there were many more of them. But that wasn't the last change they made. By November 1914, there was a train that was like an ambulance, or it wasn't used as an ambulance, and this, as you can see in the photograph, had hospital beds in it, and later on they even had an operating theatre where they could do operations on men to help save their lives. But it was a problem using trains because obviously they were using the trains to transport troops to go and fight, and also weapons and all those things, so there was a lot of pressure on the rail system. So another solution that came in 1915 was they used canal boats on these wide man-made rivers in northern France, and they would use these boats to take men to the coast or to base hospitals. So there were lots of ways that they solved transport problems. So in your book, write down a paragraph about how the British Army improved transport over time. On page 153, so that's the end of the bit about transport. On page 153, it starts to talk about the medical problems on the Western Front. Use the information on this page to help you answer these questions. It's basic comprehension for the first two, and questions 3 to 8, you need to use the table at the bottom of page 153. Here's a summary then. Trench foot was a painful swelling caused by standing in muddy conditions, so it's particularly bad in the winter. Trench fever was caused by lice, and that caused flu, and it was really common on the Western Front. Shell shock is another medical problem, so it's not a wound or an injury, but it was happened frequently in the trenches. So what did the army do? They helped prevent trench foot. They realised what caused that the lice were the cause of trench fever, so they dealt with the lice, but shell shock was not so well dealt with. So the first question that you'll answer on this section of your exam paper asks you to describe 2 features like on the Anglo-Saxon paper. So pause the video and describe 2 features of medical problems caused by living in trenches. So remember, 1 sentence about giving the feature and one sentence adding the detail, and then repeat for the second 2 marks. Pause the video while you do that. Okay, we're going to look now at wounds and injuries then, because obviously those were medical problems that were caused just by living in that environment, but obviously it's very dangerous to be there, not just because it's smelly and unpleasant, but also because you're actually obviously fighting in a war. So the first type of wound and injury were caused by shells and shrapnel, and you can see the top picture shows a World War I shell, and inside there are metal balls that when this shell explodes, like you can see in the bottom picture, hits the ground or hits something, it will shatter, it will break open, and these small balls will fly through the air. And as it says in the textbook, these were responsible for 58% of the wounds, and it could kill or injure a soldier immediately. And anyone in the way was likely to get wounded. 60% of wounds were to arms and legs. Another weapon that was very widely used in the First World War were machine guns, and there's a link in the notes for the video to a short video about machine gun use in the First World War. Bullets caused 39% of wounds. Machine guns could fire 450 rounds a minute, and these if a machine gun bullet hit you, or a row of machine gun bullets hit you, it could literally chop a man in half. So machine guns were very, very powerful weapons. And lastly, rifles were still being used. So a sniper might use a rifle. He would be aiming on duty and aiming for any movement he could see in the trench of the enemy. So for each of these weapons, use the information I've given you or the information in the textbook on page 153 to 154 to help you explain these weapons that caused injuries. Wounds very quickly became infected on the Western Front, and one type of infection was tetanus. It gave men fevers and headaches. There wasn't a vaccine for it, there was nothing to prevent it catching this, but from the winter of 1914, so very early on in the war, everyone who had an injury, had a wound, was given an anti-tetanus injection, and that prevented infections developing. So this was pretty successful. This, remember, tetanus is a bacteria in the soil on the Western Front that caused infection. Another infection was gas gangrene, and this caused swelling in the place where it had happened, lots of pain, and the tissue around where the wound was continued to be damaged by this infection. There wasn't a cure for this, and it was really hard to clean a wound well enough to get all of this bacteria out of it. So this was not successful. There was no cure. Even by the end of the war, gas gangrene was still a really big problem for soldiers who were wounded. Head injuries were also a big problem. At the start of the war, the soldiers had no real head protection, just cloth caps. And so in 1915, the army started Brodie helmet trials. It's a steel helmet, it has a strap under the chin, and it reduced fatal head wounds by about 80%. But interestingly, the numbers of men who survived a head injury increased, and that's probably because where they were maybe hit on the head with some shrapnel or something, they got injured, but it saved the helmet saved their life. And so by 1915, all soldiers had steel helmets. Gas attacks were another big problem. There were 3 types. The first was phosgene that was used in 1915, and that could kill someone in 2 days. Chlorine was also used by the Germans in 1915. That caused suffocation because it went into your lungs and they filled up with liquid, and there was no real treatment. But the army did give out gas masks to troops just a couple of months later in July 1915. Mustard gas wasn't used until 1917, but this was very frightening because chlorine gas, you could see it was like a greenish colour, whereas mustard was invisible, and so this also was very feared by soldiers. Have a look at the sources on page 115. There's 3 different sources here. The painting, this painting by John Singer Sargent that is on the screen here, is at the bottom of that page, but there's also a poem and a notebook describing the effects of a chlorine gas attack. So answer the questions on the slide using these sources. Okay, we've reached the end of the lesson. Well done. Just checking, complete the sentences below so that you are recapping all the work that we have done this lesson. Well done. There's been lots to do, so well done for persevering and getting to the end of the lesson.